Prime Minister Mark Carney will visit China next week to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Mark Carney's plane touched down in Beijing, the first Canadian Prime Minister to step foot in China for an official visit in nearly a decade.
We have to talk to each other if we want to make progress and address issues. We have now unlocked a path forward to address current issues and to build the enormous opportunities between our two countries.
Breaking tonight, Canada just made a move that quietly rewrote the balance of global trade, and Washington didn't see it coming. While the United States was threatening tariffs, annexation, and economic punishment, Ottawa was doing something far more dangerous to American leverage. It was building exits. And today, those exits just became real. Earlier this morning, Prime Minister Mark Carney landed in Beijing. Not for symbolism. Not for diplomacy theater. This was the first Canadian prime ministerial visit to China in 8 years, and it comes at a moment when the United States is losing its grip on the very system it once controlled. Behind closed doors, Canadian and Chinese officials are discussing tariff rollbacks, long-term supply contracts, and trade pathways worth tens of billions of dollars. And the reason this is happening now has one name written all over it: Donald Trump. For decades, Canada's economy functioned on a single assumption: that access to the United States would always be stable, that American markets would remain predictable, that trade would never be weaponized against a neighbor. That assumption collapsed the moment Trump returned to power and began treating allies like assets to be seized. Tariff threats. Annexation rhetoric. Economic coercion. Trump made it clear that dependence on the United States was no longer a safety net, it was a vulnerability. And Carney responded with the only move that actually works in a world where trade is power. Diversification at scale. To understand how dramatic this shift is, you have to look at the numbers. As recently as 2023, nearly 75% of Canadian exports went to the United States. 3 out of every $4 Canada earned from trade depended on Washington's goodwill. That structure gave the US enormous leverage, and Trump knew it. Then came the collapse in Canada-China relations. In 2018, Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou at the request of the United States. China retaliated by detaining 2 Canadians for more than 1,000 days. Trust evaporated. Trade froze. And by October 2024, Canada imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, aligning directly with US policy. China responded with precision. 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and meal, 75.8% on canola seed, 25% on seafood and pork. The impact was brutal. Saskatchewan's canola exports to China collapsed to just $96 million in August 2025, a 76% drop year over year. Manitoba's pork industry reported annual losses of $19 million. Entire regions felt the shock. And then Trump escalated. Threats of tariffs, threats of economic punishment, even talk of annexation. Suddenly, the risk wasn't losing one market. It was losing the only market Canada depended on. That's when Ottawa's calculation changed completely. In October 2025, Carney met President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the APEC summit. It was the first leader-to-leader contact since 2017. Xi extended an invitation. Today, that invitation became action. China is already Canada's second-largest trading partner. Two-way merchandise trade reached $7 billion in 2024. But that figure hides the real story. Canadian exports to China were just $29.9 billion, while imports reached $88.8 billion. That imbalance wasn't capacity. It was blockage. Before tariffs and politics intervened, China was one of the largest buyers of Canadian canola, pork, and seafood. Canadian energy firms were planning liquefied natural gas projects aimed squarely at Asian demand. Chinese investment in Canadian infrastructure was growing. Then everything stopped. Now it's restarting, but under very different conditions. The core of today's talks is brutally transactional. China removes punitive tariffs on Canadian agriculture. Canada phases down its 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Bloomberg reports that this exact proposal is on the table. If it happens, prairie farmers regain access to their second-largest market. Pork producers recover millions in lost revenue. Seafood exporters reopen supply chains that never should have closed. But the real shift isn't agriculture, it's energy. When the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion came online in mid-2024, it changed Canada's trade geometry. With a capacity of 590,000 barrels per day, Canada could finally ship crude to the Pacific at scale. And China was waiting. In the first 3 quarters of 2025, Canadian oil exports to China surged more than 240%. This wasn't opportunistic buying. Chinese refineries retooled to process Canadian heavy crude. Once refineries adjust, switching suppliers becomes expensive and disruptive. That creates lock-in. And here's the part Washington doesn't like to talk about. When Trump seized Venezuelan oil supplies, China lost access to roughly 144 million barrels of heavy crude. Canada filled the gap. Quietly. Permanently. Energy infrastructure creates path dependency. Pipelines, ports, shipping contracts, they last decades. You don't undo them with a tweet or a tariff threat. By the time Washington realized what was happening, the leverage was already gone. Carney's goal is explicit: double Canada's non-US exports over the next decade, from roughly 25% to 50%. And the trend is already moving. Canadian exports to Asia and Europe grew through 2025. Aerospace shipments to Singapore jumped 67%. Crude flows to Asia surged. Ottawa allocated $159 million over 3 years to help firms enter non-US markets. This isn't a pivot, it's a structural rewrite. China isn't the destination. China is the pressure valve. By reopening trade with Beijing, Canada isn't choosing sides, it's creating options. And options are leverage. Trump understands leverage, that's why he weaponizes trade. But weaponization only works when there's no alternative. Once alternatives exist, threats lose force. China needs Canada. Stable supply, rule of law, long-term contracts. Canada needs China, not for loyalty, but for balance. This is strategic autonomy. Beijing sees the opportunity clearly. Chinese state media welcomed Carney's visit as a reset. President Xi personally scheduled meetings. China understands that Trump's aggression is pushing partners away.